I have no witty introduction, no hook, but what we're going to think about today, I'm almost going to say it's one of the most important things in all of our Christian experience. It is I'll just put it this way, it's a neglected concept in the American church. And part of the reason it's neglected is because we live in such relative comfort. I think that's a hard thing for Americans to believe, because most Americans, the vast majority of Americans, never travel outside of America to see other cultures, to see how people in other parts of the world live. We live in a very comfortable world. Now, yes, there are people who are poverty-stricken right here in America. There are people who are struggling in virtually every way right here in America. Even accounting for that, in America, an American Christian has a relatively cushy experience. Paul writes in 2 Timothy 1:12, when he talks in reference to his appointment from God, that he would be a herald, an apostle, and a teacher of the gospel. He says in verse 12, that is why I am suffering as I am. This is a theme that you're not going to hear a lot of sermons about. I don't hear sermons. I hear a lot of pretty good sermons on how to live a better life and how to position yourself so that you will experience God's blessing. And those are not bad messages, but I can't remember hearing a message that says, okay, everybody, get your notebooks out, write this down. Because Paul is a model of a devoted and dedicated follower of Jesus, we can draw an important conclusion from the model of his life. Write this down. You will suffer. That's not why I came to church. This should be, as I referred to last time, a sanctuary. Well, maybe it is, but really, it's just an auditorium. It's just where we get together and we look at life. We look at God's design and we look at life and we draw conclusions for how we're going to live our lives. And one of the things in that is reality is, if you're going to follow Jesus, you're going to suffer. For crying out loud, let's look at Jesus' life. It was not a life without suffering. He suffered on several levels. He suffered rejection from the religious leaders, and not just rejection, but direct animosity to the degree that they figured out a way to have him murdered. And oh, by the way, his death was not a happy or a simple death. It wasn't quick and easy. He suffered until he died. Paul suffered, and he tells us here the reason he suffered is because of his taking the gospel and saying yes to these appointments that God had made for him. You're not going to have to go looking for suffering. You don't need to. Paul didn't go looking for suffering. It found him. Well, it will find us as well, but not if we insulate ourselves in such a way that we won't suffer. Now, I got to be careful here, because on either side of the extreme on this suffering issue, you have, well, somewhere between bad ideas and just plain insanity. All right. The one extreme is I am going to make sure I suffer for the gospel. And so I do and say things, and I say them and do them in such a way that I make enemies, and enemies will make me suffer. And this suffering makes me more godly. Okay, that's an extreme. And honestly, it's founded on lies. Okay, here's the other extreme. I'm going to be happy and comfortable, and my life, the first bullet point on my agenda for life is to be happy and comfortable. And I'm going to leverage every available technology and technique to be happy and comfortable, because that's what God wants for me. Okay. Those two extremes don't work. Okay, number one, if you're going out there and you're making it your business to make sure you suffer, okay, you are trying to be God. Really. You are in the worst case, in its most horrible form, you are usurping God's authority in your life and taking it for yourself. On the other hand, if it's all about your comfort, then basically what you're doing is choosing to arrange your life outside of God's design, because it's not about your comfort. So what is it about? Is it about suffering? No, suffering will happen. What is it about then? It's about your holiness, your likeness to Jesus, your reflection of Him and His nature, His ways, His will. Paul said he was suffering as he wrote the letter to Timothy because of his response to the appointment to carry the gospel as a herald, an apostle, and a teacher. These things created a response or reaction from a world that doesn't want the gospel. And he lived in a world that was hostile to the gospel. Okay, we, thank God, in America, do not live in a world that is hostile to the gospel. If you are on social media, you may get the impression that the church is under attack by, you fill in the blank, everything from liberals to conservatives and nationalists to socialists. And hey, you know what? Let's be realistic. Has there ever been a time when the church was not under attack from its enemy? See, listen, the enemy of the church is not a political ruler. As often as even right today in parts of the world, these tyrannical, totalitarian, political rulers are in strong opposition to the church. They're not the enemy. They're only tools of the enemy. Who is the enemy of the church? Satan himself. Has been from the very beginning. You remember? That's a bunny trail. There's no reason for me to take us down here, but here's the point. It's simple. Satan always wants to do what Jesus said the thief does: steal, kill, and destroy. Peter wrote that our enemy, the devil, is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Okay, that's reality. But here's the other reality. Jesus said he would establish his church, and the gates of hell would not stand against it. They would not prevail. Oh boy. So being a devoted follower of Jesus is not an insurance policy against suffering. We do the gospel wrong when we imply that saying yes to Jesus and to the good news is the most comfortable thing you could ever do. It will make your life so much easier. And here's why that seems appealing, is because there's just a drip drop of truth in that. The best way to live your life is within God's design. That's where the benefits and the blessings come. But they are a secondary outcome. They are not getting blessing from God is not the point. Being in relationship to Him and by His grace living within His design is the point. And secondary outcome is life works best that way. You don't have to go looking for suffering. When you live within God's design, you will experience it. Paul he told Timothy, don't be ashamed of me because of my chains. That was part of his suffering. And here he says, I'm suffering this way because of the direction of my life, to be a herald, an apostle, and a teacher of the gospel. Then he goes on, again in verse 12, yet this is no cause for shame. See, the suffering that he experienced, he didn't look at it as, oh, gee, if I was a bitter apostle, this wouldn't be happening to me. I just must mess everything up. He wasn't ashamed of his suffering. In a way, it was like a merit badge. Although Paul didn't live his life according to merit. He lived his life according to grace. But his suffering was nothing to be ashamed of. This is no cause for shame. Then he goes on with this phrase that is so full of power. Because I know whom I have believed and am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him until that day. There's just too much there to start on this time. So next time, we'll pull that apart and look deeply and ponder it deeply, because it applies for us as well. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.